6:11 a.m., July 27, 1945. A green John Deere sat silent in the middle of a wheat field, rows of gold bending under a low, gray sky. The harvest would be overripe in 48 hours if nothing moved. Clouds promised rain. The sun had not yet burned the dew off the stalks. Thomas Reed stood with his hands on his hips and listened to nothing but his own breath and the far-off rumble of a pickup engine. No parts. No time. War was supposed to be winding down, but its ripple reached into the most ordinary places. Across Texas, farms were working with what they could spare. American hands were thin, and American towns had their own losses to count. In 1945, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war. Nearly 50,000 lived in Texas, assigned to camps and sent out to tend crops, milk cows, mend fences. They were not soldiers in the fields by choice. They were men who once wore uniforms and now bent to harvest the land of a country they had fought against. Suspicion and necessity sat beside each other on the same bench. Thomas had 12 of those men working on his place that summer. They came and went under a camp guard shadow, a sergeant with a careful face, a cigarette rolled in his fingers, watching the men move with practiced distance. The prisoners had practical skills: bakers, mechanics, carpenters, skills the farms desperately needed. But none of that mattered the morning the magneto coil on Thomas's tractor decided to quit. The coil was a small thing, tucked under the cowling, a coil that turned battery and spark into motion. To the farmer, it was the difference between a wagon full of wheat and an empty field in a few weeks' time. To Thomas, it was everything. He had no spare coil. The nearest parts dealer was miles away and closed until Monday. The weathermen on the radio were already talking about a front moving in from the west. He cursed softly, then went to the edge of the field and watched the men work the alfalfa like a choreographed line. Their hands moved with a calm that irritated him and comforted him at once. One man in particular, thin, with long, capable fingers and a face that was not quite older or younger than the rest, paused and came over. They called him Carl. The paperwork that rode with the prisoners lists names, numbers, and origins. Carl's last name appears in the notes with several spellings. There, Waber, Weber. So which is correct is indefinito. He wore the standard issue clothes, but when he leaned into the engine, the clothes fell away, and what remained was a practiced mechanic, someone who understood engines like an old friend's pulse. Carl crouched and smelled the air as if it were a warning. He rubbed his thumb along a broken lead. He said quietly, "Maybe I can try." Thomas considered the guard standing back with arms folded, and then nodded. There was nothing to lose. What followed was not a miracle. It was improvisation, a kind of practical poetry.
Carl walked to the fence line and selected a length of wire, old barbed wire, stiff with rust and sun, whose original purpose had been to keep animals in and strangers out. He worked the wire with pliers, stripping and twisting until the metal shone bright and hungry in his hands. He scavenged a nail for a contact point and put that nail to a grinder to knock off the burrs and shape it into an improvised terminal. The smell of metal and urine of oil gathered in the air. A wind went over the wheat, and somewhere a rooster complained. The men around him watched. They had seen mechanics before, had heard them work miracles and small fixes, but never with barbed wire and a nail. The sergeant shifted. Thomas stood close enough to see the sweat at the base of Carl's neck, the little crease of concentration between his eyebrows. Carl did not rush. He threaded the cleaned wire into a gap where the coil had been broken, twisted, looped, secured with a tight, ugly knot. "Stupid," someone muttered behind them, half laugh, half disbelief. The word hung there like a dare. Carl wiped his hands on his trousers and gave a nod toward the crank. Thomas climbed onto the seat. He cranked once. The tractor coughed again. The engine tried to be faithful. The second crank caught the starter's hope, and then refused. You could feel the field hold its breath. Thomas' knuckles went white around the handle. Carl leaned in, his breath warm on Thomas's wrist. He adjusted a connection. His fingers were steady, as if tuning a violin. He tapped the new contact with the nail, a tiny percussion that mattered. The third crank was shorter, sharper. The engine took it like a sleeper waking, then rolled and spat and came alive with a reluctant, glorious roar. The sound shattered the listless morning and stitched it into cheering. Men slapped backs. The sergeant's cigarette fell from his lips and was forgotten in the dirt. Thomas laughed, a short, almost surprised sound, then swore in a relieved whisper. The truckers nearby where the harvest equip was parked came running. A boy who had been sweeping the barn kicked the broom and danced. The wheat seemed to stand straighter, as if grateful. That night, in a farmhouse lit by a single lamp, Reed invited the prisoners in. It was awkward at first, the plate passing with careful hands, the way they glanced at one another as if rehearsed civility might snap under pressure. But the meal softened edges. Stories came out in fractured English and German, in hands flapping like birds, and in the universal vocabulary of fatigue. Karl talked about engines, about a workshop before the war, about a city whose name sounded like music, Stuttgart, though the ragged records were not precise. He did not speak of politics. He spoke of tools. At one point, a toy truck, the kind a boy could hold in his fist, was passed across the table. A child's axle was broken.
Karl took the toy on his knee and, with the same focused care he had given the John Deere, fashioned a tiny pin and set the wheel spinning true. The boy's eyes widened. Later, as plates were cleared and the coffee passed, Karl said in a tired voice, "Thank you for letting me feel useful again." It was not a flourish. It was a small human confession. Someone muttered, half-teasing, "There'll be work waiting." A laugh loosened more than just shoulders. Conversation took root. Morning came, and they moved through the field like a single organism. The prisoners and the neighbors and Thomas's son worked the rows, the repaired tractor pulling the header that took the gold from the fields and fed it into wagons. Rain threatened on the horizon, the sky tightening like a fist. Machines complained, belts slipped, but the John Deere kept its patient rhythm. When the storm finally broke, it came with thunder and a sharp wind that drove sheets of rain across the land. But by then, most of the wheat was in wagons and barns. They saved the crop. 2 months later, Karl was put on a truck with other prisoners and taken back to a ship to cross an ocean whose waves were as uncertain as the fortunes of men. He left with a quiet handshake and a photograph tucked away, an image, Thomas later said, that turned up over the years, a black and white picture of himself standing by the tractor, a smile in which gratitude and fatigue had met. Years after that, in a small workshop in Germany, a photograph of a tractor above a bench became part of the day's light. Karl returned to a country in pieces, but took with him a lesson as well, the dignity of being given work to do, the way a skill can translate into human trust. Thomas kept a letter Karl sent later, folded and browned with age. The wording was simple, and the handwriting hurried but steady. It thanked him briefly for the food and for allowing the work. It said the repair had meant more than just a running engine. It had been a bridge. For Thomas's family, it became a relic not of victory, but of a shared survival, some small human exchange in a time otherwise catalogued by losses. Decades passed. The John Deere lived beyond Thomas and through Thomas Jr.'s childhood, through winters and barn leasings and weddings. People fixed what they could on the old machine and saved receipts for parts that came and went. A curious thing happened. The original makeshift wire, twisted and knotted and pounded into place that July morning, remained. It was replaced in spots, rewrapped, soldered over, but the spirit of that repair was there. On more than one stubborn morning, when the battery was tired and the carburetor needed coaxing, the tractor would cough and start the same way it had in 1945, on a stubborn, unlikely insistence that began with a length of fence wire and a nail. When Thomas Jr.
took the seat years later, hands calloused in different ways, he would pat the cowling affectionately and say the same thing his father said, in a voice shaped by memory. "That stupid wire trick saved us." There was no irony in it, only the acknowledgement that something small had carried them through. The story that began because of a broken magneto coil did not end with mechanical success. It rippled outward in ways a farmer's ledger cannot show. Men who had been enemies were fed, trusted to work, and allowed to exercise skill. A guard watched and then looked away as neighbors exchanged jokes and tobacco. A photograph traveled across an ocean and found a place over a workbench. A letter crossed borders and found a mantle. The harvest returned to the barn. A machine that should have been obsolete kept lending itself to the stubbornness of people who knew how to make do. If there is a simple moral to it, it is not sentimental. It is practical and raw. When someone is given the chance to be useful, to apply a craft, to be entrusted with a task that matters, something like respect grows. It is not a cure-all. It does not erase the reasons men fought or the sorrow that visited both sides, but it does build moments, small structures of cooperation that can last for generations. There are questions a historian might still ask. Karl's last name appears in records with multiple spellings. The precise details of his life before and after the war have gaps that invite verification. The scene as told here preserves the sequence of events as remembered by the family and their neighbors. Tractor fails, Karl improvises, engine starts, harvest saved, farewell, and a photograph that returns in memory. Those are the fixed stones in this story. In the end, the title stands as an honest surprise. A stupid wire trick, a crude, improvised workaround that might have made a tradesman wince, did more than get an engine turning. It saved a season, kept livelihoods intact for one more year, and offered a small demonstration that trust can be practical as well as moral. The wire did not sign treaties. It did not make the war disappear. But it did what small things do best. It connected two sides long enough for people to see each other as people. Share this story if it surprised you, and check the description for sources and links should you want to read more about POW labor in Texas and the records that remain.